Good afternoon. I'm Sister Carol Jean Vale, president of Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia. It is an honor to be with you today to introduce a Chestnut Hill College alumna, Tia Noelle Pratt, class of 1999. Time passes quickly. I remember Tia as an enthusiastic, inquisitive, friendly student in our College for Women. It is a special moment to have the privilege to introduce a successful graduate, one in whom great potential was always evident. Those of you who have attended or ministered at a women's college know there is a special bond created over those 4 years, student with student and student with faculty, staff, and administrators. I'm not saying it is better than those ties characteristic of coeducational institutions. It is just different. And I recall those 11 years of my presidency before we transitioned to coeducation with great fondness and pride in the women who attended Chestnut Hill College. In just a few minutes, Tia will speak on The Call is Coming from Inside the House, Anti-Racism and Charism of the Sisters of St. Joseph. I have no doubt that her words will challenge and encourage us to improve as we work to create college environments that are enriched by inclusion, equality, and equity. Colleges that are anti-racist. Tia Noelle Pratt, PhD, is a sociologist specializing in the study of systemic racism in the Catholic Church and the ways in which that racism impacts African-American Catholic identity. Dr. Pratt received her PhD in sociology from Fordham University and is the director of the Mission, Engagement, and Strategic Initiatives at Villanova University and the president and director of research at T.N. Pratt and Associates, LLC, an inclusion and diversity consulting firm. Dr. Pratt is also the curator of the hashtag Black Catholic Syllabus. More information, including references to her scholarship and the hashtag Black Catholic Syllabus, can be found on Dr. Pratt's website, www.tiaaprat.com. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Tia Noelle Pratt. Tia.
Thank you, Sister Carol Jean. It is a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much for inviting me. And now let's see if I can share my screen and start the presentation. Let's see. All right, there we go. So as Sister Carol Jean said, and thank you again, Sister Carol, for that wonderful introduction. The title of my talk today is The Call is Coming from Inside the House, Anti-Racism and the CSSJ Charism. And I want to start by giving just a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about my approach to this work, about systemic racism and anti-racism, a bit about my specific research in this area, and I'll conclude with some remarks about the Black Catholic Syllabus, which was launched almost a year ago on June 10th last year. So here we go. So some of you may recognize this very kind face as belonging to Father Brian Massengale. And Father Massengale is a theology professor at Fordham University. And in 2017, Father Massengale gave the keynote address at the Ignatian Family Teach-In, where he talked about how when we have these conversations about race, these what he called honest adult conversations about race, people may feel uncomfortable. And as he put it, this work ain't going to be easy. And I appreciated what he had to say that day because it is very much the approach that I take as I do this work. We have to be ready to be uncomfortable. We have to be ready to make others uncomfortable. And it's important that we allow ourselves to be in that space. that space of discomfort and creating discomfort, because that's the only way that this work of understanding systemic racism, of doing the work of anti-racism is going to get done. And an approach that I use and have used for a long time comes from the work of sociologist Joe Fegan. And Professor Fegan talks about racism as being foundational and systemic. You know, there is so much discourse, vitriolic discourse in our society right now about systemic racism not being real. And one of the things that I have spent truly my entire adult life working on is about systemic racism and the way that it lives in our institutions and impacts how all of us live our lives and live our lives in institutions. I'm a sociologist, and that's really the key element of being a sociologist, is understanding how we live our lives in institutions. And so Professor Fegan talks about how systemic racism pervades all of society's core institutions: the economy, education, politics, religion, the family. I mean, just think about how, you know, just now in earlier this year in 2021, we've had our first Asian American and our first African American vice president. We're not too far removed from our first African American president. The fact that so far into this, we're still talking about those kinds of firsts tells us just how deeply these things are embedded into our society. And Professor Fegan goes on to talk about systemic racism as being oppressive and exploitative, that it is designed to exploit land and labor for the material and social benefit of those who created society's core institutions and the hierarchies that lie therein. And in my approach to this work, one of the things that I talk about repeatedly is how it is not enough to not be someone who engages in the mano a mano or personal racism. And that's the racism of, you know, racist graffiti and using racial slurs and burning crosses on people's lawns. I mean, that it's not enough to not be that person. We must also think about the ways our systems are designed to oppress some while benefiting others. And this is really a key principle of critical race theory, which we've been hearing a lot about, much of it misinformation, but we've been hearing a lot about in the last few months. And one of those key principles is that the seemingly benign race neutral policies that have the effect of maintaining and perpetuating white supremacy regardless of the policy's intent. And that point right there, as I used to say in class quite often, you know, at that point, I want us to take that thought and hold it, because we're coming back to it. And students used to love when I say, take that thought and hold it, because we're coming back to that. But before we can come back to that, we need to, what I like to say, be on the same page about race relations, racial justice, and anti-racism, and what these things even mean. And especially when I use these terms in my work and in talks such as this, and in my writing, you know, what we're getting at. You know, the model of race relations is the model of personal racism. That's the model that only sees racism as something that happens between individuals. That is the racism of a few bad apples or a few bad actors, and doesn't take into consideration the way that racism impacts our social structures. And from there, you know, we have moved into a model of racial justice, which looks at these issues from an institutional and systemic point of view, but doesn't really do anything about them. And the conversation has moved in some circles and needs to move more broadly to a place of anti-racism. That's the conversation that as church and in higher ed and in Catholic higher ed and in our society more broadly, we need to have that conversation and talk about the ways in which anti-racism works to dismantle these systemically racist systems and rebuild them in ways that are just and equitable. And anti-racism has three phases. The calling out of the racism, the making people uncomfortable. The second phase being white folks realizing either that they're racist or not as progressive as they thought they were, or at the very least that the systems are racist and designed to work in their favor. And part of this second step is the realization that white supremacy is much more than the Klan, the Proud Boys, and other armed violent organizations. Those organizations, those violent paramilitary organizations are designed to invoke fear, to terrorize, and by doing so, making those that are marginalized, particularly African Americans, too frightened to pursue their rights, pursue justice, pursue systems that will work for everyone and not just a few. So it is this armed paramilitary wing of white supremacy that makes all of the other realms of white supremacy possible. And that is something that we don't talk enough about in society. And the third phase of anti-racism, as I've framed it in my work, is doing the work of dismantling racist systems in order to build systems that are anti-racist. And I have the work here in capital letters, for a very specific reason, because we have to think about the work as just that, something that happens in capital letters, something that is just that important. And well, I'm only here to do parts 1 and 3. And I always like to give a shout out to my wonderful former student who made this for me, this gift for me, as I told her, I'm here to break down systemic racism, like Wonder Woman smashing the glass. And in 20 minutes, she sent this to me. So I'm very grateful to her for that. But as I said, I only do parts 1 and 3 because in reality, part 2 that I outlined a moment ago, that's the part white folks need to do amongst themselves. And that part is essential, but I can't do that part because as people of color say, we didn't make these systems. And because we didn't make these systems, it is up to those that make them and benefit from them and perpetuate them to really do that part of the work. So, over the last year and a half, we've seen a lot, a global pandemic that still isn't over, that has killed almost 600,000 people in this country alone. We've seen the murder of George Floyd and all that resonated with in society, all that resulted in. But it wasn't just the murder of George Floyd. It was Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Trayvon Martin and Emmett Till and so many others in between and since that have brought us to this global reckoning that started nearly a year ago and that we are still in. And the church is not immune to that. It's not immune to that at all. And we have to realize that the call is coming from inside the house, that it's not, these things aren't something that happens far away. It's not something that happens on somebody else's campus or somebody else's congregation. It is happening where we all are right now, and we have to deal with it. We cannot make, this will not wait any longer. And so as we move forward, I want to talk with you about some of the ways the systemic racism in the church factors into my own work. And in order to do that, we need to start with the numbers. You know, the Census Bureau, the most recent data from the Census Bureau tells us that there are 43.9 million Blacks in the US, those that identify as only one race, because we know that since 2000, we can check as many boxes as we like in the race question on the census. But when we're just looking at those that check only one box, we get 43.9 million Blacks in the US, or 13.4% of the US population. Well, since the census doesn't ask about religion, we need to go to other sources for that. So CARA, the Center for the Applied Research in the Apostolate at Georgetown University, tells us that there are 72.4 million self-identified Catholics in the US, or 22.1% of the US population. Now, that is those who are self-identified as Catholic. Those are the folks that check a box, not necessarily folks that are active participants in Mass or the sacraments or any of those things, those that are just going to check a box when asked. Well, very recently, back in February, Pew Research Center released a really groundbreaking study on Black Americans called Faith Among Black Americans. And I was very glad to be a consultant on this project for a little over 3 years. And and as a result of this project, one of the things that we have learned is that 6% of Blacks in the US are Catholic. Now, that number includes those who just check one box on the census, but also those that identify as Afro-Latino or identify as Black or African American, as along with some other racial designation. So, but if we're just using the number that I gave earlier from the Census Bureau, 6% of that would give us 2.6 million Black Catholics in the US. The USCCB tells us that there are 3 million Black Catholics in the US. And given that the Pew numbers include Afro-Latinos or those who are of mixed race, including Black or African American, then that 3 million makes a little more sense. But what that tells us is that approximately 0.75%, between 0.75% and 1% of the US population are Black Catholics, and a little over 3.5% of Catholics in the US are Black. Well, those numbers, frankly, they just don't add up. Given the number of Blacks, the number of Catholics, the number of Black Catholics is disproportionately small. Yet, we're still talking about millions of people, whether we're talking about 2.6 million, 3 million, or even more. We're still talking about millions of people. The people isn't nobody. And that still means, even with that lowest number that I just gave you of 2.6 million, there's still more Black Catholics in the US than there are Black Episcopalians or members of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the core Black Protestant denominations. So, why don't these numbers add up? Well, the short answer is racism, but we'll get deeper into that as we go on. But a key part of that conversation is about the perception of this fundamental incompatibility between being Black and Catholic. And one of the things that I have argued in my work since I was an undergraduate, and I started doing this work as an undergraduate at Chestnut Hill College, that fundamental incompatibility does not exist for Black Catholics. Being both Black and Catholic cannot possibly be incompatible for those who are, in fact, Black and Catholic. Those who claim both of these identities figure out a way to make it work. But this brings us to, the racism part of why that number is so small. And we have here the wonderful Nobel laureate and Roman Catholic, which I don't think is as well known as it should be, Toni Morrison. And Toni Morrison once said in an interview, if you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And we need to confront the ways our church has put Black people on their knees. And we can look at this in terms of the history of Black Catholics in the United States and the ways that systemic racism has impacted that collective experience and the way systemic racism is still impacting that collective experience. The most extreme form of systemic racism, slavery. And it is essential that we think about this in terms of what the church was in the United States, and remember that it wasn't always this massive institution that we understand it and know it to be today, that it wasn't always this massive institution that was a major provider of social services and healthcare and education from pre-K through PhD. And from first grade to PhD, I am a product of Catholic education in this country. So I can tell you just from that about how massive an experience, massive the institution is just in that realm of education. So, but before all of that really took shape, the Catholic was deemed a mission church by the Vatican in the US. And it was a fledgling institution struggling to fit in with its Protestant neighbors. And in those efforts to fit in, acquiesced to and perpetuated racist norms as they established footholds in the United States. My colleague at Villanova, Dr. Shannon D. Williams, in her work talks about the church being the largest corporate slaveholder in the Americas. And that is something that we don't talk enough about as church, and the ramifications of that as we continue to move forward and continue to deal with and reckon with these issues of systemic racism. And beyond that, the denying Black men and women access to the priesthood and religious life, and even in the 20th century, in the mid 20th century, when that access started to become officially allowed in wider circles and spaces, that it was still so difficult that we didn't have the access, and we didn't have the numbers that we should have, and that still resonates today. Just where I grew up and where I currently live in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, Black men were not allowed to attend the seminary until the middle of the 20th century, and still did not graduate its first Black seminarian until 1974, who is still in active ministry today. So that just tells you that none of this was that long ago. Another key element, denying Black Catholics access to the basics of Catholic life, like the sacraments and parish life. I mean, we still have people Black Catholics who are alive today who will tell you about not being able to receive their first communion along with all of the other communicants, that they had to wait out over on the side until all of the white children had received communion. I mean, those things, they stay with you. When that happens at 8 and you're still telling that story at 88 like it happened last Sunday, that shows just how deeply these things resonate and the way that collective trauma impacts collectively how Catholicism is experienced. And yet we still have greater numbers of Black Catholics in the United States than we do Black Episcopalians or members of the AME Church. So as I started to allude to a minute ago, the consequences of this are still being felt. They're being felt in the minuscule numbers of African Americans in the priesthood and religious life. That's being felt in congregational leadership. It's being felt in our colleges and universities, our parishes, our schools, our chancery offices. I mean, chancery offices in particular. I mean, let's think about that for a minute. I mean, why is it that Black leadership in our chancery offices begins and ends in the office of Black Catholics in the few dioceses that still have offices of Black Catholics? Because there are many that don't anymore. So I know that's been a lot in just a few minutes. So, let's take a pause and really think about, as we transition into the next part of our conversation today. In what ways do we need to break down the structures of systemic racism in our Catholic institutions, and especially in our Catholic higher ed institutions? And so that brings us to this section of the conversation where I'm talking about my own work. And so I am working on a book that right now is called Faithful and Devoted: Racism and Identity in the African American Catholic Experience. And I'm using mixed qualitative methodology to push back against this lingering idea that being Black and Catholic are not compatible, as I talked about a moment ago, or that there are no Black Catholics. You'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be, about how often I hear that, oh, I didn't know there were Black Catholics, or that what few Black Catholics there are in the United States only trace their origins to conversions that took place after World War II. And that's just not true. And another piece that I take on in this work is, pushing back against what I call the exoticism of Black Catholics. And that happens when scholars of Catholicism, white scholars of Catholicism in particular, talk about something that is perfectly wonderful and beautiful because it is ordinary, and give it the air of the extraordinary or the exotic because it's Black Catholics who are doing it. When in reality, there have been Black Catholics globally as long as there have been Catholics. There have been Black Catholics in the United States since before there was a United States. So this exoticism is something that happens because just because something is new to white scholars doesn't mean that it's new. And that's something that my work pushes back on and needs to push back on in terms of how we see whiteness and the way whiteness is centered in Catholicism. So another point that I make is that systemic racism in the church is as another reason why we have such a small number of African American Catholics, and that racism continues to impact Black Catholics' experience through things like church closings, parish reorganizations, school closings. Here in Philadelphia, we're losing 2 of our diocesan high schools at the end of the school year. I mean, that is a very painful and difficult process. And the core piece of what I do is really talking about Black Catholic identity as an act of resistance to that systemic racism. That resistance comes from bringing one's Blackness, one's whole self, as Sister Thea Bowman talked about, into the life of the church. And a minute ago, I talked about that core principle of critical race theory, and I said, hold that thought because we're coming back to it. And here we are, in our colleges and universities. I mean, let's think about it for a minute. If the canonical sponsoring congregation of an institution maintains leadership of the institution, but the congregation is all white, then by definition, there will be all white leadership. So, that is one of the ways, just one of the ways that even in Catholic higher ed, we can see that core principle of critical race theory manifesting itself when seemingly benign race neutral policies actually perpetuates white supremacy. And in drawing again on the work of Professor Fegan, how it's built into the fabric of the institution. I have a line in my book where I say, systemic racism is woven into the fabric of our society the way strands of hair are woven into a thick braid. I mean, it's just that intricate and that intimately connected to how our society is structured. And so in the book, I focus a lot on issues of race, space, and place. And one of the things I talk about is parish life and the 2 key ways that Black parishes have come into being in the United States. Parishes that were specifically created as such as St. Peter Claver in Philadelphia, or those that developed through neighborhood changes and the collapse of the national parish model. And so I'd like to spend a few minutes talking with you about St. Peter Claver. And this is the southwest corner of 12th and Lombard in Philadelphia, also known as the location of St. Peter Claver. And St. Peter Claver has not been an active church for a long time, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And you might notice that it does not look like what you might think a Catholic church, especially one in the Northeast, would look like. And there's a reason for that, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So the story of St. Peter Claver officially begins in 1886, when Black Catholics in Philadelphia came together under the name of Peter Claver Union, and they came together to worship like our early Christian forebears, mainly in homes, because they were not welcome in established churches. And together, they came together to found the first Catholic church in Philadelphia designated for ministry to Black Catholics. You know, after dealing with things like segregated communion lines and pew fees and being banned from parishes, as I mentioned a minute ago, you know, church on Sunday didn't provide a respite from the racism they were experiencing every day, like it did for our friends in the historically Black Protestant denominations. So 12th and Lombard in the late years of the 19th century was a prime location for the members of Peter Claver Union to found and open their church, because the neighborhood was in a period of transition and becoming heavily African American. And the church was built to be the Fourth Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia. That's why it doesn't look like what a Catholic church might look like, because it wasn't built to be one. And the Fourth Presbyterian Church had moved into West Philly. Their congregation had moved into West Philly following their congregants as part of that neighborhood transition. And so the members of Peter Claver Union fundraised to raise the money in order to purchase the church. Yet, the parish's own 75th anniversary document gives credit to St. Catherine Drexel, the Holy Catholic Fathers, Archbishop Ryan, Patrick Quinn, who was an official of Beneficial Bank, which was founded by St. John Neumann when he was Archbishop of Philadelphia, doesn't give credit to Peter Claver Union, who raised almost 90% of the money to buy the church building. The funds that came from St. Catherine and Patrick Quinn and the Holy Ghost Fathers only came at the very end to really seal the deal in order to purchase the building. And the document only gives passing reference to Black parishioners whose loyalty and sacrifice made St. Peter Claver possible. It doesn't mention their financial contribution at all. But in order to get the church purchase finalized, in order to get the building consecrated and be able to use it, that was essentially the price they had to pay to get their church. What they did get was protective language that said that St. Peter Claver would always be used for the benefit of Black Catholics in Philadelphia. But this high cost that they had to pay, and not just in dollars, but that high cost in the history, in the story, in their contribution, you know, this is what happens when someone else writes our stories. This is why, you know, having that voice is so important. And so the story of St. Peter Claver continues. You know, by the 1980s, the neighborhood is changing again. African Americans are moving out of the neighborhood. Gentrification is on the horizon. And with this photo, I just want to point out that quickly that this is a park that is a block away from St. Peter Claver, and that is newly built. And you see that it's got all of the amenities for children. But I really want to draw your attention to this parking garage, which is one block east and one block south of St. Peter Claver. And this parking garage was built in the 1980s. Now it's starting to show its age, of course, but it was really a marvel in the late 80s when it was built. It runs the length of an entire city block. It is a mixed use building that is common today, but wasn't common 40 years ago, where we have a retail space on the first floor and then a parking garage above, and in a neighborhood that is notorious for not having adequate parking. This parking garage was really a marvel. You know, it will take research and understanding beyond the scope of what I'm doing to determine if the parking garage ushered in gentrification or was a result of it, but the connection is unmistakable. So as this is happening, the Archdiocese commissions a report. The Sites and Boundaries report, as it's known, was commissioned in 1984 with its final report issued in April of that year. And it recommended keeping the parish open, keeping the church open because it was financially viable because the school had closed and it was within this urban renewal area. It had real symbolic significance for Black Catholics in Philadelphia who might feel abandoned if the church was closed. And the issue of the protective language may lead to, as the report called it, unpleasant complications. Well, Cardinal Kroll, who was Archbishop of Philadelphia at the time, rejected the recommendations of the report and suppressed the parish in May of 1985. Well, that suppression triggered a long court fight, which ended in Philadelphia's Orphans Court in 2017, and where the protective language was interpreted as to allow for the sale of the property. So while that ended the civil court fight that had been going on for so long, the Friends and Descendants of St. Peter Claver had organized themselves as such and filed an appeal in canonical court. So the story of St. Peter Claver isn't over. In fact, just before I joined you today, I saw that I got an email that I'll have to read later from one of the leaders of the Friends and Descendants of St. Peter Claver, most likely updating me on their progress. But, you know, what does all of this mean? You know, this means, you know, the loss of our churches, the loss of our sacred spaces. But for our conversation in terms of higher ed, you know, we have to think about how this impacts racial minorities, the poor, those who are already marginalized, and that an institution can't continue to marginalize people and expect those people to be active in the institution. It just doesn't work. So how does this connect to Catholic higher ed in particular? Well, I mean, the story of St. Peter Claver and Catholic higher ed, you know, for those of us who are attached to institutions that are in cities, you know, it invites us in a very particular way to think about how, you know, our institutions play a role in gentrification of the surrounding community, you know, and what does that mean for the people that live in that area? What does it mean for the people who are served by the institution itself? You know, is the mission of our institutions being sacrificed on the altar of U.S. News and World Report rankings? I mean, these are difficult questions that we have to ask. You know, has an institution that was once conceptualized as a school now conceptualized only as a business? And just to think about that, you know, we can think about how the language of business is used in higher ed. The chief academic officer, the chief information officer, and so many others. And you know, this brings us to the question, you know, is an anti-racist church even possible? You know, and my answer to that will actually, it will depend on the day that you ask me, because I really struggle around this. As a scholar, as a practicing Catholic, as a scholar of Catholicism, you know, those who work towards an anti-racist church must realize that everyone will not want to be part of that conversation. Some will actively thwart it. You know, the folks that I call the unconvincibles, those who bemoan wokeness, who equate being Catholic or Catholicism with whiteness, and therefore say that anti-racism isn't Catholic because it isn't white. Those who want to focus on all the positive things, which really means slavery ended. You know, why can't you just shut up and be happy when we've still got so much else that's going on? And you know, that one of the things that Father Massengale said in a panel that he and I were on a couple of months ago, that the church will only go to the limits of white comfort, and that dialogue. And let's think about that for a minute. That as we started off today talking about making folks uncomfortable and being uncomfortable. If our church will only go to the limits of its own comfort, then we cannot do the work that is necessary in order to achieve the anti-racist institution that we need. And dialogue is not a useful exercise with those who are not open to a new perspective. That's when you find that people are talking at you instead of with you. So in order to really achieve an anti-racist church, doing the work must happen in all facets of church life. Our chancery offices, our congregational leadership, congregational membership, board leadership, education, everything, faculty, curriculum, board leadership. Yes, I said it again because it's so essential. Hiring practices, contract bids, everything, parish life. Our approach to problems and struggles like the sex abuse crisis, orphanages, we're still hearing about, and we'll be hearing about for a while, church-run residential facilities for Indigenous children in Canada. And that's taken on a new level of conversation just in the last few days. And we're going to be hearing more about that here in the US. It's only a matter of time. So in short, we must push our church beyond the limits of white comfort. It's the only way this is going to happen. And I hear a lot when in the consulting work I do, in the nonprofit sector work that I do. Oh, we want Black people, we just can't find any. That is not an answer. It just really isn't. If you haven't found any, it's because you're not looking hard enough. So that's real. So that's something that we need to grab onto as well. And that's also about moving beyond the limits of white comfort. So how can the CSSJ Charism inform this work? Well, as we mentioned earlier, I graduated from Chestnut Hill College in 1999. And as Sister Carol Jean Vale said, Chestnut Hill was a women's college when I attended and graduated. And I am very proud to be a graduate of a women's college. It is a huge part of my identity. And it is something that I don't hesitate to tell people because, as a woman, as an African-American woman, we live in a society that doesn't hesitate to tell me that I don't matter and will not hesitate to find new ways to tell me I don't matter. And to be a part of an institution that exists solely for my benefit, it was such, as an 18-year-old going to college, it was such a huge factor in the young adult I was, the adult that I am now, the scholar that I am. This is why women's colleges matter. This is why HBCUs matter, because that marginalization and knowing that these institutions exist solely for your benefit, it factors so completely into how one sees the world and how one deals with that message from society. So, so of course, I'm a graduate of Chestnut Hill College, but I've been around Sister St. Joseph since first grade. And so I've come to have an understanding of the charism and what that means, what I've learned in all of these years. And the teaching of self-sufficiency and being ready for any good work, whether that is lace making in France or a college education on a hill in Philadelphia. Being able to teach people how to make their way in the world is intimately connected to what the world is. It is intimately connected to how we go out and do the work. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't hear about the dear neighbor until years after I had graduated. But one of the things that I have been thinking about, over the years, and really in a special way in preparation to be with you today, is, who is the dear neighbor, and how pertinent that is in higher ed. The question demands that we look at things like hiring and contracts and student discipline and HR policies, and ensuring that white comfort is not maintained at the expense of those who are supposed to be the dear neighbor, because that is not the work. And if we're going to do the work, then we must really do it and not just say that we're doing it. So I mentioned earlier that the Black Catholic syllabus is something that I launched last June. This period of history that we're all living in calls us to concrete action, and I felt like this was something that I could do. And the syllabus is a collection of resources related to Black Catholics in the United States. It's intended for academics, journalists, educators, diocesan institutions, the general public, congregations of women and men religious. And it prioritizes the work of Blacks in order to center the voice of Black Catholics in the creation of our own narrative, going back to the story of St. Peter Claver that I talked about earlier. And so you can find it, you can Google # Black Catholic syllabus, or you can go right to tiapratt.com, TIAPRATT.com. And so what happens now? We keep up the fight for justice by doing the work. And that means actively resisting the racism that plagues our church. That means getting into trouble. As John Lewis said, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. My dear friend, Sister Cora Marie Billings, who is a religious sister of mercy, taught me how to get in trouble. She's still getting in trouble herself. And so we talk about that a lot. And I see this work that I do as the modern day overturning of the money changers tables. That's where I take my instruction from the Gospels as I do this work. And as we continue to do this work, we must keep in mind that the call is coming from inside the house. And so thank you for having me today. And so before we turn to questions, we can take a minute and pause and perhaps think about, what do I know now that I didn't know before? So I will stop sharing my screen, and then I will hand it back over for some questions if you have them.
So we'll begin our period of question and answer. We invite you to place your questions and comments in the chat. Please continue to do that with your comments. A great deal of applaud, Dr. Pratt, for all of the work that you're doing as appearing in the chat. And so again, I join folks in thanking you for your words and for the wonderful work that you're doing. So we will be launching into now our Q&A, and there are some great questions that are showing up in the Q&A. Our colleagues are actually compiling some of those questions, since sometimes it can be difficult to do several things at once. But I think the first question is, what ways have you found that help students of color feel accepted at places like ours, which may still be majority white in demographics?
Well, a few things. One, students of color need to know that the rhetoric of the institution and the actions of the institution match. Because when they don't, they'll know. And they'll know when they're being gaslighted into thinking that they're not seeing what they're seeing or experiencing what they're experiencing. So, and that requires work. That requires, an auditing of your student handbook, of your faculty and employee handbook. That requires making sure that, when you say that there are specific consequences for infractions, that those consequences are felt by everyone, not just some folks, not just the students of color. Students of color benefit from seeing themselves and their experiences reflected in the curriculum. They benefit, every student, in fact, every student benefits from having, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans represented and reflected in the curriculum. And if that's not there, that needs to be addressed by August. Students of color in a particular way, but all students benefit from faculty of color being on campus. But those faculty of color carry a special burden, especially when there's only one or two. And that's where cluster hires matter. That's where really putting in the work as an institution matters. Institutions put their money behind what they value. So as an institution, what are you putting your money behind? And are you putting your money behind making sure students of color feel comfortable? So, and as I mentioned, board leadership. So curriculum, faculty, handbook, board leadership. Start there.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question, where might the inquiry start as we connect this history to our work in Catholic higher ed? Where do we begin this work?
So begin in terms of materials to learn from. If that's the question, I would say the first place you can begin is Black Catholic syllabus at www.tiapratt.com. And also too, I am working on, it's not out yet because we're still working on it. I'm working on a chapter with a co-author that will be part of an edited volume on Catholic social teaching and Catholic higher ed. And my co-author, Dr. Maureen O'Connell, and I are working on the chapter on race and racism. And this volume is intended for administrators, board leaders in Catholic higher ed, and in order to grapple with these issues through the lens of Catholic social thought. So that's something to look for. We're working on that with Paulus Press. But those are two concrete things in terms of reading materials and learning materials in order for places to start. But frankly, look at your faculty, look at your board leadership, look at your curriculum. If the English department has a course on writers from the United States and Toni Morrison and Louise Erdrich and Amy Tan aren't on it, then you need to throw out that syllabus and start again.
Thank you. Another question, how do we keep white folks at the table who don't want to be uncomfortable?
Well, those are the unconvinceables. Those are the folks that not only don't want to be part of this conversation, but will actively thwart it. And to be quite honest, I mean, those folks are going to try and upend all of this work because they don't want to be a part of it. And so there's, as Father Massaguel says, as I reiterated today, I mean, dialogue isn't dialogue with people who are not open to a new perspective. So the work's got to get done by the people who are ready to do it, who are ready for any good work, as I said a minute ago. And some folks just aren't ready. But what can be done is creating a place for them when they are ready.
Absolutely, thank you. There are a few comments and questions here about the Black Catholic Church, and some things that are happening also with our Latinx communities. So the correlation that was transpired with Black Catholics is happening in some dioceses with Latinx and ongoing women in the Catholic Church. Do you have any comments about that correlation in particular?
So, you know, I will say that first, you know, what I do and where my expertise lies is in what I talked about today. In terms of the Latinx community, you know, there are wonderful colleagues who are doing extraordinary work in this area. You know, Brett Hoover, who is a faculty member at Loyola Marymount, comes to mind quickly, and his book, The Shared Parish. There are a number of scholars in theology that are doing an important work in this area. What I will say, and what I try to emphasize in my work, that those of us who are not just racial minorities in society, but racial minorities in the church, have to find the spaces and places where our needs and our demands of our church coincide, and to not let the systemic racism create be used to pit us against each other, because that happens. That happens particularly with the Latinx community and the African American community. And it's important that we understand what is truly happening and resist it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that response. There are some questions related to the hashtag Black syllabus in courses and how it can be used, not just in theology or liberal arts or history, et cetera, but in the sciences in particular. And if more and more, but if change is to happen, how do we aim this work towards all of our students, not just those in the liberal arts disciplines?
So I would say the first thing, the first thing really about that when we're talking about say the natural science, is really to combat erasure. You know, when we talk about, and not just those scientists who have been erased from the history of their particular disciplines and their achievements and their contributions been erased, but also look at the ways that Black and brown folks in particular have been used and abused and oppressed in the name of science. You know, the ways that Black women slaves were essentially tortured, and in creating the basis of our knowledge of gynecology. I mean, let's not erase that. Let's not erase the role of Black women and what we know about that particular medical specialty. You know, women who were operated on without anesthesia or all kinds of things without their consent, because they couldn't give consent. They legally couldn't give consent. So combat erasure is my advice. In both the scientists who contributed to what we know and those whose exploitation contributed to the information and knowledge that we have.
Failed to unmute myself. Still monitoring some of the questions, and there are some great questions that are coming up in the chat. There was a question, and I'm sorry, as I'm looking at the chat and trying to follow along, I do not have all of the actual questions in the document that we are compiling, but there is an interest in a question. There are a few people who are interested in a question from Sister Joan Lisinski. And if you could actually open your mic and ask that question, that would be very helpful. So please open your mic and ask your question, Sister Joan.
I think it got asked early on and it was responded to.
Okay, fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Another question then is, and we've touched on a little bit of this, but can you tell me if you've witnessed any institution of higher education that is actually doing this work and doing it well?
Well, you know, Georgetown just started doing it well. But of course, Georgetown, you know, was forced to do it well. It was forced to do it. It didn't initially do it well because initially Georgetown thought that they could change a couple of names on some buildings and that would be it. But as I said, institutions put their money behind what they value. And even initially when they started to treat the descendants of the 272 slaves who were owned by the Maryland province of Jesuits, and the money from that was used to financially stabilize Georgetown. When they started to treat those descendants as legacy applicants for admissions, well, I mean, that's all well and good, but you know, they didn't put any money behind that at first. So now that there's money behind that legacy admissions policy, now that there's work not just from the university but from the Jesuit community to put money behind this and doing this work. I mean, that's part of you know what needs to happen. And I will say, you know, the Jesuits are ahead of other institutions, other communities, because the history was always there. It wasn't talked about, but you know, learning about this was part of Jesuit formation. They knew this. They just didn't talk about it outside of those small circles. There were books and theses written about this for years, so it was always there. It just wasn't, you know, talked about the way that it needed to be. So that being said, you know, the history part is there for the Jesuits more so than probably other communities. I mean, there's a book about Vincennes slaveholding in Missouri. But even that's not talked about the way that it should be. So you know, there's still so much work that needs to be done, and you know, just in the last couple of months, and even it's not perfect, but it's starting to be done well in that regard.
You've touched on it a little bit, but especially with this last question. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some insights on how we might use more effectively this idea of service to the dear neighbor, and who we actually consider our dear neighbor as we continue our work.
Yeah, and you know, that goes back to the rhetoric and the actions matching. You know, the rhetoric of the dear neighbor has to match the actions of the institution. So we know, so when you do that, when you do audit of the student handbook, when you do that audit of disciplinary procedures for students, and you find that white students and Black students are treated differently for the same things, well, then who's the dear neighbor there? The dear neighbor is not the already marginalized Black student. In fact, that already marginalized Black student is being further marginalized at the institution. So that requires, you know, the hard internal work of that hard internal work of, you know, going past the comfort level, being ready to do the upheaval in curriculum and discipline and hiring that needs to be done in order to make sure that this can be what it needs to be. But, you know, and if you're looking for a one-line answer, if your rhetoric and your actions don't match, then you are not serving the dear neighbor.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm going back to some of our questions that are popping up on the screen very quickly. And thank you everyone for your wonderful questions. Someone here says, I'd love to hear more about how you implement Sister Thea's motto with students in your own classes. That is, how do you encourage students to I come to my church fully functioning? That doesn't frighten you, does it? I come to my church fully functioning. I believe myself, my Black self, and all that I am and all that I have and all that I hope to become. I bring my whole history, my traditions, my experience, my culture, my African-American song and dance and gestures and movements and teaching and preaching and healing and responsibility as gifts to the church.
Yeah.
How do you implement this in your own teaching?
Well, I mean, the first way I implement it is to truly bring myself, my Black self, into everything that I do. My whole self, my teaching and preaching and African American song and dance as a gift to the church, because frankly, it is a gift to the church. You know, I could be studying and working on anything. I chose to study and work on this because the church needs it. It needs me. That being said, the church doesn't make it easy. And half the time, and if you've read anything that I've written, you know that half the time I've got one foot out the door because it is so hard. But, you know, so, you know, I implement that in my classroom, first of all, by doing that, by being that. And it is in doing that and being that I can encourage students to do the same, to model for them what I hope they will be, not just as students, but in the world after their days as students are over. And always remembering, as difficult as it is sometimes, that, you know, this church needs me, that I am a gift to this church.
Thank you. And I really love the idea of modeling that for our students. Someone asked similarly then, and I'm going to paraphrase the question, but we have so many students on our campuses. We are becoming so religiously diverse on many of our campuses. How do we use these same ideas with students who may have other religious backgrounds that are outside of the Catholic tradition, or even outside of the Christian tradition? How do we do the same for those students?
Yeah, you know, when I taught my Black Catholics course, before I got to Villanova, I taught at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, which is a Jesuit university. And the middle part of the course is about Jesuit slaveholding. And what I wasn't prepared for the first time I taught the course was the difficulty students would have with facing this, you know, the Jesuit, this part of Jesuit history that they didn't know about. And so, you know, as the semesters went on and I taught the course again, I would begin that section by telling students that, you know, they may have feelings about this, and that that's okay. And that whether they are Catholic or not, whether they are Christian or not, there's something about the institution's values, about what the institution says it is, that brought them there, that made them apply in the first place, that made them decide to go there when they had other options. And so, you know, to lean into that, to draw into that, you know, from a Jesuit perspective, you know, what it, you know, whether that is being men and women for others, you know, whether it's finding God in all things. And I know that, you know, Pierre Medallia was a Jesuit. So, you know, those values are very much a part of the CSSJ charism as well, you know, part of that foundation, part of that history. And so I encourage students to lean into those values that brought them to the institution in the first place. And that, you know, this knowledge is not necessarily something that can make them turn away from that, but it can be something that compels them to compel the institution to be what it says it is, that the act, so to make sure that the actions match the rhetoric. And so that is the context for my answer of, you know, our students that are not Catholic or perhaps even non-Christian, there is something that brought them to our campuses. There is something about what we say we are that brought them to our doorstep. And we have to, you know, make sure that we continue to be that for them, and make sure that, you know, that these values can be their values, even if they are of a different religious tradition or no religious tradition.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you. I'm looking at our time, and I want to be sure that I don't run over. Are we scheduled till 1:15? I do apologize for not having that in front of me.
That is my understanding.
Okay. All right. So looks like we're running out of time. I guess I will pose one last question in the final few minutes. And that is looking at, talk a little bit about sexism in the Catholic Church, because so many of us are coming from women's institutions. Can you address the intersectionality with Black Catholics and things such as that sexism that we often see in the Catholic Church?
So, you know, I will say, you know, again, you can't study Catholicism without sexism being a big part of it. But what I do, you know, what I was invited to come here and talk about was race, was systemic racism. And so it's important not to kind of pivot away from that into a totally different conversation. But, you know, we can't talk about Catholicism without talking about that. And, you know, it is essential, you know, that we realize the role that women play in this church, whether we're talking about lay women who run the committees in the parish, or we're talking about our women religious who built the healthcare and education and social services that are the framework of what this church has become. And making sure that credit is given where credit is due. And so, you know, in the last couple of minutes, you know, to emphasize that, and to emphasize that everything that white women know that they've gone through in this church, Black and Latina and Asian and Native American women have gone through all of that and more. So it is essential not to lose sight of that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. There are so many wonderful questions that have been posed in the chat. I do apologize for not being able to get to all of those in our time here. But thank you again for joining us for this presentation. Thank you to you, Dr. Pratt, for your work in this area and for sharing your work with us. Our virtual reception begins in just a few minutes. Feel free to stay connected and take a break. The next speaker will begin soon at 2:30 Eastern Time, 1:30 Central. And we look forward to seeing you there. Again, thank you, Dr. Pratt, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's been good to be with you.